All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out on Indigenous Peoples Day. It's an opportunity to think about a different set of relationships that we have, not so much here in this country, but further afield. But it's my great pleasure to host Ali for this talk. We've known each other for a while. I've watched his remarkable evolution of his career and the increasingly important voice that he's having on all kinds of issues, and had the privilege of seeing this book early on in its manuscript stage, and really enthusiastically had a chance to commend it to the world, because I think it's a really important contribution to the debate about China, which is, despite our current focus right now on the hot war in Ukraine, is certainly as big an issue and as big a challenge as we need to face going forward. And we'll have a chance to how to think about how to characterize this challenge and how to think about the choices facing this challenge as Ali talks about his book and his approach to this question. Just by way of background, you've probably seen the bio. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but he's currently a senior analyst with Eurasia Group Global Macro-Geopolitics practice. Very grandiose title. Needless to say, focusing on U.S.-China relations. But he's also been a junior fellow across the street at the Carnegie Endowment, a research assistant at Harvard's Belfer Center, and a policy analyst at RAND, which is one of my former homes, so I was glad to see people there. And I've also gotten to know Ali in connection with his position as a David Rockefeller Fellow with the Trilateral Commission, which I've been the chair of the David Rockefeller Fellow Search Committee for a long time, and it's always a great pleasure through that to get to know some of the young rising thinkers. And so he was certainly an easy and obvious choice for that. So I'm going to ask him, briefly to talk a little bit first about why he decided to write the book. I always like to know what leads authors to decide that the time has come to write something in what's obviously a crowded field of analysts, and then sort of his broad thesis as how he would like us to think about both the nature of the U.S.-China relations and how that shapes our choices on the policy side. So over to you.
Here, let me see. Okay, this is working. Good. I just wanted to make sure this is working. Well, first of all, Dean Steinberg, a real honor and privilege to be with you. Thank you so much for gracing my book with your imprimatur. A real privilege. Thank you for that plug. I appreciate that. Thank you for gracing the book with your imprimatur, and a real privilege to be here at SAIS. Dean Steinberg and I were just talking a few minutes before coming on stage here, and I was saying that SAIS really has emerged, and this is a difficult mantle to claim. It's a very difficult distinction to claim, but one of which you should be extraordinarily proud, Dean Steinberg. I really do think that SAIS has emerged as the nation's foremost center for grand strategic thinking, the nation's foremost center for big picture, grand strategic applied historical thinking on challenges of world order, challenges of U.S. foreign policy. And again, given the number of centers that are competing for that title, I think it's a really extraordinary distinction and a well-deserved one. So congratulations to you and your colleagues. So I'll just give, I think I really want to dive into a conversation as soon as possible. So I'll try to be brief. Brevity is not one of my strong suits, but I'll try to discipline myself and so we can get to a conversation. So in terms of the immediate impetus for writing the book. So the title of the book, as you saw, the main title is America's Great Power Opportunity. Great Power Opportunity, of course, being a kind of a spin on great power competition, which is very much one of the buzzwords, geopolitical buzzwords du jour. I first began thinking about writing this book, I would say probably in mid-2018. And so obviously, just by way of some temporal context, so mid-2018, so it's just a few months after the Trump administration has released its national security strategy, a few months after the Department of Defense has released its national defense strategy. And these two high-level strategic documents, they take the term great power competition and they really propel it to the fore of mainstream discourse. And I was intrigued not only by the speed with which it achieved this escape velocity, but a number of other factors. One, it no longer was just confined, it was no longer just sort of languishing in obscurity in academic circles or scholarly circles. It really had become kind of a commonplace, a staple of the mainstream discourse. And I, just by way of a joke, but only half joking, kind of half serious, I noticed that in 2018, when I would attend events around town at institutions such as SAIS, at think tanks, Folks would be milling in, they would be sitting down, and the moderator would say, almost by way of a throat-clearing exercise, as folks were sitting down, as everyone knows, we're entering into a new era of great power competition. I said, gosh, I better figure out what this phrase is. And it was ubiquitous. And what I discovered, though, so I was intrigued not only by the ubiquity of the term, I was doubly impressed, and it's a real credit to the architects of the term. In this town, for high-level national security foreign policy constructs to achieve that level of resonance on a bipartisan basis in the halls of Congress, among government officials, just in the broader mainstream discourse, it's a remarkable achievement. I mean, in D.C., folks don't agree on anything, let alone a high-level national security foreign policy construct. And I'd be curious, Dean Steinberg, what you think, but there are only two other examples that sort of readily come to mind in terms of high-level constructs that have generated that level of resonance. There's containment and then global war on terrorism. So I set out to sort of figure out what is this term? What exactly is the United States competing over? What is it competing for? And what I say in the book is that I, at least in my conversations and in my research, I found a pretty marked gap between the ubiquity of the term on the one hand and the underspecification of the term on the other hand. And that is to say, ubiquity, as I was just saying, the term is everywhere, it's in the air, it's in the water. And at a very broad level, when you ask folks, what does great power competition mean? What does it denote? At a very broad level, there's some general agreement of what it refers to. So it means that interstate competition, yes, it's waxed and waned in its intensity over the past 4 centuries, but it's been an immutable feature of geopolitics during that time. The United States is relatively not as influential as it once was. China and Russia are more able and willing to push back. But once you kind of come down a little bit and say, okay, given that description of that diagnosis, again, what is the United States competing for? What is it competing over? You get a lot of disagreement. So again, a gap between ubiquity and underspecification. And so one, I wanted to see in writing this book if I could bridge that gap and impart a little bit more clarity to this term and understand what exactly the United States is competing over and for. I wanted to see as well if in dealing with a resurgent China, in dealing with a revanchist Russia, could the United States find kind of an intermediate disposition between complacence on the one hand, which I think it's fair to say we succumbed to in the heady 1990s, of which I'm a product, but also finding, so avoiding complacency, but also avoiding consternation. One of my big concerns, as you'll know from having read the book, is there's always a risk of overcorrection. And I think that it's fair to say that in the years after the Cold War, the United States believed too much in kind of the end of history notion that democracy and capitalism would be inexorably ascendant. That obviously hypothesis proved to be, or that hope proved to be incorrect. But I do worry now that we aggrandize needlessly beyond what's warranted the strategic acumen of China, the strategic acumen of Russia. So I wanted to write the book to say, one, to make the case for quiet confidence, to say we don't want to understate China and Russia, but we don't want to overstate their competitive potential. Let's focus more on what's within our control, renewing our unique competitive advantages at home and abroad, and competing with China and Russia, not ubiquitously, but selectively. I think that when the United States uses competitive anxiety as one tool as part of a broader toolkit, it's very useful. But when the United States almost reflexively invokes China and Russia to justify all manner of measures at home and abroad, and when we send a signal to allies and partners that we're using China and Russia as crutches, and that absent invocations of China and Russia, we're incapable of getting anything done at home or abroad, I think it sends a mistaken signal. So one, in terms of just to summarize, and then I'll stop. So the first objective was to try and get a handle on this kind of intrinsically malleable, elastic term. What exactly is great power competition? And I should say, actually, what is a great power? That's also a debatable term. What is competition? That's an even more debatable term. You put the two terms together, and the ambiguity is almost endless. So what exactly is great power competition? What are we competing over and for? How do we right-size the competitive challenges from China and Russia so that we're avoiding both complacency and consternation? And how do we think about investing anew in ourselves so that we signal not anxiety to our allies and partners, but we signal confidence, and we speak at least as much about the aspirations that we seek to achieve as the anxieties that we seek to dispel?
That's great, and very succinct. Thank you.
Good.
So I'll just drop the footnote on whether the 90s were, in fact, a period of complacency. As you can imagine, I have some views on that. Sure. And I want to start, because we are at a university, and I have seen several of my students out here. It's slightly on the wonkier end, because you've invited us that, and then we'll go to the more practical side of it. So you're right. I mean, this is kind of a triumph for the IR theory world that this framing came about. But there are two senses that we try to unpack this you could think about, which is Some of it comes from the notion that it is a generic problem, right? The Graham and the Thucydides trap, Mearsheimer, the neorealist school that sort of sees the world of international relations as inherently zero-sum. And it's just structural, right? That this is what happens. And there's a second part which is not, totally separate from the other, but focuses more specifically on China rather than any generic rising power. So maybe you could start by thinking, how much do you think this debate and this framing is about and is driven by the kind of the international system is driven by anarchy and therefore it's zero-sum, as opposed to the specific nature of the Chinese regime and as a competitor with the United States?
Well, absolutely. And I do think that we can't overstate the importance of sort of the China factor. And now, when we talk about great power competition, we often see juxtapositions of China and Russia. There are questions about whether Russia belongs to the category of great powers, and then again, raising the question, what is a great power? That's probably a whole separate conversation. But it is difficult to overstate the kind of the China aspect of this debate. And I think, and I try to make the point in the book that when we talk about competition between the United States and China, yes, there's a military dimension, an economic dimension, a technological dimension, a diplomatic dimension. The argument I set forth in the book and that I'll reiterate here is, I think perhaps the most critical level of competition between the two countries, and it gets to your question, Dean Steinberg, is it's psychological in nature, it's narrative in nature. Just by way of a personal digression, my parents are here, and so I have to, since I'll embarrass them a little bit, but this personal digression is important. So, and it goes to show, again, how much sort of the psychology of China's resurgence looms large in informing this debate. So it might come as something of a surprise. I don't know if I actually shared this story with you, but I actually, when I was growing up, I had no interest in political science at all. I had no interest in world affairs at all. I hated to read. I loved math. I thought I was going to be a math major. And my parents, when I was growing up, they would beg me, Ali, please, open a newspaper, open a book, please learn about the rest of the world. And when I look back, yes, I loved math and I didn't like to read, that's true, but I think when I kind of psychoanalyze myself in retrospect, coming of age in the 90s, for me, American preeminence, it wasn't an aberrant condition, it was just an inbuilt condition. And if you had said to me, let's just go back exactly 30 years, if you had said to me in 1992, when the Cold War formally concluded, if you had said to me in 1992 that China would pose the multifaceted competitive challenge to the United States that it does today, it would have strained credulity. I would have been utterly incredulous. And so I think that in retrospect, I felt, why do I need to learn about a resurgent China? It's not going to be resurgent. And I think that, and so in terms of the psychological challenge, there's no other country, and Professor Allison makes this point, I don't know that there is a historical precedent for a country that so rapidly has accrued so much power and influence in so many categories so quickly. So it's the speed of China's resurgence. It's also the unexpected phenomenon of China's resurgence. Again, in sort of the heady 1990s, I wouldn't go so far as to say that there was a conviction, but certainly a hope among many segments of the policymaking community, many segments of the analytical commentariat, that democracy and capitalism would be inexorably ascendant, that China and Russia were on the wrong side of history. And when a country not only accrues that much power and influence so quickly, but that country that is antithetical to your own in so many ways, because a country, when I was growing up, I said, a country that has a regime type that China does, those regimes can't innovate, but China's demonstrated that it can innovate. China's going to, I thought, would succumb to the pressures of globalization. It's adapted to the challenges of globalization. So there's a profound psychological challenge in dealing with China. And I think, and then I'll stop here, I think that one of the biggest challenges for the United States in dealing with China is avoiding thinking about a new Cold War that has a decisive resolution. One of the mistakes, I think, of analogizing U.S.-China competition to a new Cold War is, when you think about a new Cold War, we know how Cold War 1.0 ended. The Soviet Union collapsed in dramatic fashion, and the United States won. China has all kinds of challenges at home. Its external environment is increasingly contested, but I think it's far more likely that China is going to adapt, it's going to muddle through, and I think it's going to endure as a competitor in perpetuity. So what does that mean for U.S. foreign policy? It means that America's competitive task is not the pursuit of a decisive victory, and it's not even clear what victory would mean given the range of interdependencies that we have, but instead, how do you forge a strained, ambiguous, uncomfortable cohabitation? That latter undertaking requires a very different kind of diplomacy, and one that I don't think we've practiced before.
But I want to push you on this a little bit more because, I mean, you're not old enough to remember, but it was only the 1980s or till the late 1980s, perhaps early 1990s, that some of this framing applied to U.S. views about Japan, right? And the idea that we're being overtaken and that some of the zero-sum thing. But I'm trying to get you to focus a little bit more on how much the ideological piece is important here, because I mean, they were obviously, you know, Japan was seen as a more statist, less market-oriented, but it was still not, you know, so how much is this, you know, Mearsheimer-Waltz, and how much is this Huntington? I mean, in the sense that, and the reason it's so resonant is precisely because it's communism back, as opposed to a different kind of great power competitor who doesn't challenge the deep U.S. ideology.
There's a critical ideological dimension, and I think it's interesting. If China, I mean, just by way of a thought experiment, let's imagine that China, it had its present level of power and influence, but it was democratic. Would the United States be as nervous about a resurgent China with its present level of power and influence if China were democratic? I think the answer is almost surely no. It's concerning to the United States that, again, a country, now, and I hasten to enter into this caveat, I don't know that the ideological component of competition between the United States and China, at least today, is as salient as it was or is as pronounced as it was during the heights of the Cold War. But there is certainly an ideological dimension there, and I think that it's concerning for many U.S. policymakers and many U.S. observers. Could a model that is so antithetical to ours in so many respects that we thought had been consigned to the dustbin of history, could it offer potentially a compelling alternative to countries in many countries in the developing world, and perhaps even more concerningly, could it sow concern among our own constituencies, among democracies? Could it sow concerns among citizenries and democracies that perhaps democracies aren't delivering? Now, I don't think, I don't think that we should overstate sort of China's ideological sell. It's not clear to me that the disillusionment with democracy translates into enthusiasm for authoritarianism. But I think that there are real questions about which model of governance is best equipped to manage the challenges of modernity. One formulation that I really like, it's by Yuan Ong. She's a brilliant political economist at the University of Michigan. She wrote an essay, I think it was August 30th, late August, I believe, and she said that U.S.-China rivalry, we often talk about it as a great power competition or a clash of civilizations a la Sam Huntington, but her formulation is, she said it's more accurate to think of U.S.-China rivalry as a clash of gilded systems. And she said in both the United States and China, you have income and wealth inequality that are soaring, you have elites that are increasingly aggrandized, and you have middle classes that are increasingly disenfranchised and disillusioned. And so even though the United States and China, they obviously have very different governance systems, they have very different political systems, they both are struggling with quelling growing middle class disenchantment. But I think to your point, the ideological dimension is critical, and that's why, as President Biden says, as Vice President Harris says, as top members of this administration say, it is imperative for democracies to demonstrate anew, not just in word, but indeed that they can deliver. That's going to be critically important.
But if that's right, I mean, does that then change the choices that are available for policy? So, you know, if you think about the evolution of the U.S.-Soviet competition, right? After sort of the crises that we're so reminded of now, like the Cuban Missile Crisis and stuff, you had this sort of basically a consensus developing around the idea of coexistence, culminating in Dayton, Helsinki and the like, which was fundamentally challenged by Reagan and the Committee on the Present Danger. Basically said, you can't do this, right? You can't coexist, you can't live with this. And if this framing, whether it's not similar or dissimilar to the Soviet Union, is still an ideological one, is the possibility of really coexisting possible against an ideological challenger as opposed to just a country that wants a bigger piece of the pie?
So I would almost, you know, and not to evade the question, but I would almost recast the question to say, is there a realistic alternative? I mean, I think if you look at a country of China's proportions, again, for all of its challenges at home, for all of its challenges abroad, it's a country of well over 1 billion people. It has the world's second largest economy, which by IMF estimates, I believe it's about 80% as large already as that of the United States. It has the second largest defense expenditure. So, I mean, a country of, and importantly, largest trading country, largest exporter, a linchpin of global supply chains. So this is not a country that can be readily decoupled from the core of geopolitics. This is not a country that can be readily excised so that the United States can advance its vital national interests solely in alignment with its allies and partners. It is going to be, I think, for all of its challenges at home and abroad, I think it is going to be an enduring factor in geopolitics. And so I would almost say the question is not, can we coexist? The question is instead, how will we coexist?
But I want to push you on that one too, because you say that, but I mean, if coexistence is an unacceptable outcome, it may be cost. I mean, you may raise the question about how much are we prepared to invest, you know, to do this, and how long will it take? But if you genuinely believe that the two systems are incompatible and that we can't thrive as long as they are thriving, then there's, to some extent, you're saying, well, we can't, but I'm pushing back to say, you know, well, it may be hard, but is it sustainable for us to try to sustain, to basically to concede that we have to live in a world in which the Chinese model is tolerated, accepted, on either a moral or on a political level?
Well, and so it's, and I think actually I think your question raises an important point that I should have mentioned earlier, which is that a resurgent China, it's not a problem to be solved, it's a condition to be managed. And I think that that's a fundamental distinction. And then there's sort of a second point that derives from it. I think, and you would know, infinitely better than anyone, just given, your career at the highest levels of government. But in dealing with foreign policy challenges, again, and I'm sitting in such illustrious company. Again, you would know better than anybody else. Your choices for, and not just in dealing with a resurgent China, your options for dealing with an irredentist Russia, your options for dealing with virtually every foreign policy challenge. Your options very rarely are good, better, and best. Your options are usually bad, worse, even worse, and apocalyptic. So that's usually the gamut that you're talking about. You're dealing among suboptimal choices. And so one is this, recognize, so I would say just those 2 points, that China is not a problem to be solved, it's a condition to be managed. Number 2, you're dealing with suboptimal choices, so there isn't some sort of silver bullet for managing a resurgent China. But I would say, I think it would be premature to suggest that cohabitation is impossible, in part because the principal beneficiary of the U.S.-led international system established after World War II, after the United States, it's China. I find it very interesting. There was an op-ed published by the then chairperson of China's Foreign Affairs Committee, Fu Ying. She wrote an op-ed in early 2016 for the Financial Times, and most of the op-ed, it was basically inveighing against the U.S.-led international order, and she said, it's too U.S.-centric, it's too Western-centric, it's antiquated, it's ill-fit for purpose. But she includes a very telling, I shouldn't say concession, but a very telling admission in the piece. She said, we in China have to acknowledge that this U.S.-led system, it's made extraordinary contributions to peace and prosperity, and China has been one of the principal beneficiaries of that system. So one of the reasons, and I'm betraying my disposition as a congenital optimist, I try to discern silver linings even if there might not be any. But having said that, leaving that disposition aside, I think that there is actually analytical grounds for some optimism. One of the challenges that China faces, if China were to say coexistence is either impossible or undesirable, China would have to not only articulate and establish a coherent alternative to the present order, it would have to gain widespread traction for that system, and it would also have to lose a lot of the benefits that it's accrued by virtue of its integration into the present system. So one of China's dilemmas going forward is, how do you simultaneously inveigh against, criticize the present system when you've been one of the principal beneficiaries? That's a big dilemma. And I would also say, and then I'll stop, the United States and China, I mean, their relationship, obviously it's growing more and more strained, militarily, economically, diplomatically, but I think, candidly, one kind of optimistic spin is, it's remarkable that the United States and China, given how little basis they had for organic trust, it's remarkable that they've had so few crises in their relationship. I think that there could have been far more. I think that the United States and China, for the better part, since 1978, or actually going back to 1972, so now we're marking the 50-year anniversary of the U.S. opening to China. I think that there could have been far more crises than there actually have been. The United States and China, at least up until now, they have found a way of subordinating organic distrust to pragmatic considerations, and it certainly shouldn't be beyond the reach of creative diplomacy to continue sustaining that arrangement. And if the United States and the Soviet Union could do it, certainly we can draw lessons from their example and do the same today.
So I want to unpack several of those things. So, I mean, you point to the long period, but the critics and the people who would challenge you would just say this is Taoyang, Taoyang way, right? I mean, that this is what, just waiting to get to we're strong enough that the Chinese were smart enough to figure after Mao's early attempts in the 50s, you know, and decisions that you couldn't pick on the 800-pound gorilla till you were also an 800-pound dragon. And that's so not surprising it didn't happen before, but now is now. And so that you can't draw a lot of comfort from that. So that's the first question about whether we really should see this as, you know, a recognition of coexistence or simply biding your time. And the second question is then, so what does it look like though? I mean, what would it be, what would we have to be prepared to tolerate to have this, what you call not beyond the capacity of creative diplomacy, and what would China have to be prepared to tolerate to have this bargain and to have a kind of stable, sustainable coexistence?
So if you'll indulge me, just to sort of answer the questions in reverse order, in terms of, I would be remiss to suggest that I've conceptualized some, you know, what would a kind of sustainable condominium between the United States and China look like. But I will say, I do think that I think that we can agree that there's an essential precondition, whatever model or models of competitive coexistence might exist. I think a fundamental precondition, a prerequisite, is a mutual acceptance of the likelihood that the other will endure. One of my biggest concerns is to the extent to which leaders in the United States and leaders in China believe these interlocking narratives that China's leadership has been attempting to promulgate. Whether China's leadership actually believes in those narratives, that's a debatable question. But China's leadership is trying to gain traction for two interlocking narratives. The first is that China is inexorably resurgent, and the second is that the United States is terminally in decline. The concern is, if China really believes in those narratives, it's likely to act in ways born out of hubris and born out of overconfidence. If the United States believes in those narratives, it's likely to act in ways born out of anxiety and born out of defensiveness. And that combination produces a very dangerous spiral of competition between the two countries. I think that the sooner that the United States and China dispense with notions of zero-sum competition and appreciate the likelihood that the United States and China can't marginalize the other to a marginal role in world affairs, but that they are likely to endure, the sooner that they can get about to the hard work of conceptualizing and then operationalizing subsequently what a competitive model of coexistence would look like. So that would be the first point. And then on the first question, you know, isn't China essentially, you know, perhaps engaged in a kind of, you know, deception, and it's just waiting until it's sufficiently strong in order to really, sort of drive a competitive dagger into the United States? I think, again, to pose sort of a thought experiment, let's assume, for argument's sake, let's assume that China harbors maximalist intentions. So let's assume, and I try to posit this thought experiment in the book. Let's imagine that China, it not only seeks to overtake the United States for global preeminence, but in due course, it seeks to dissolve the present system, establish a system of its own. And let's assume maximalist intentions and leave those constant. And now let's focus on what China would realistically have to do in order to accomplish those objectives or those intentions. I'll argue, and it's perhaps controversial, but I think it's a defensible proposition. It's not even clear to me that China can achieve hegemony in the Asia-Pacific, let alone globally. And one of the reasons, and there are for many reasons, domestically, you look at their demographic outlook, which is declining. You look at an increasingly exhausted growth model. You look at an increasingly brittle system of political rule. So lots of challenges at home. But externally, I think the biggest Achilles heel for China for its medium to long run outlook is this growing gap between its economic heft on the one hand, and that economic heft continues to grow apace, but the growing gap between its economic heft and its diplomatic estrangement from advanced industrial democracies. Now, it's true that advanced industrial democracies, they are relatively not as preeminent as they were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but they still wield the balance of global power. And I've been struck, there's this narrative that we sometimes hear that China, it sees decades into the future, it has a plan of however many decades, and that it possesses this kind of unrivaled strategic acumen. If that proposition were true, I think that China would have comported itself very differently during the coronavirus pandemic. And I think it's worthwhile, just again, another thought experiment, if we rewind the clock to, let's say, April 2020 or May of 2020. We all remember the narratives at the time. In the first quarter of 2020, beginning of the second quarter of 2020, the narrative about China was it had contained COVID-19 at home, it had contained the recession at home, and the United States, by contrast, it was just flailing. And I remember thinking when I was writing the book that given that discrepancy in narratives, I said, China has the United States where it wants it, and if it's really as uber strategic as a lot of narratives make it out to be, what if China had said in early 2020, you know, let's temporarily, not indefinitely, but let's temporarily stop cracking down on Hong Kong. Let's temporarily stop intimidating Taiwan. Let's strengthen our relationships with Australia, India, Japan, and South Korea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, and as a bonus, let's take stock of all the debt that's owed to us by Belt and Road Initiative participating countries and relieve it partially or in full. If China had taken any set of those steps, I think that the Biden administration coming in would have faced a really, really steep uphill climb. For whatever reasons, whether anxiety, hubris, opportunism, China basically went in the opposite direction with the consequence that today, with the exception of its relationship with Russia, and I think that even now, I think that that relationship with Russia is becoming more and more of a reputational albatross around China's neck. Virtually all of China's major power relationships are severely more strained today than they were pre-COVID-19. You look at its relationship with the United States, with the EU, with the non-US members of the Quad. So that gap between its economic heft and its diplomatic standing with advanced industrial democracies, I think is going to impose a significant constraint on how far China can go to accomplishing whatever aspirations it may harbor. And so I think it underscores the importance of not conflating aspiration with accomplishment. We have to maintain that distinction.
But that assumes that the Chinese haven't gone through the same thought experiment. You have rejected your conclusion, right? I mean, you know, they're not dumb, and they recognize that their relations with the EU are more strained. Their relations with Australia are more strained. Doesn't seem to have, you know, caused a rethink in Beijing. We obviously don't know what goes on behind the walls of Zhongnanhai, but isn't there an alternative explanation, going back to Thucydides, you know, that the Chinese have just concluded that the strong will do what they will, right? And if that's right, I mean, maybe they just made a gigantic miscalculation. Maybe they're not far-seeing, but there's also the risk that whether they're right or wrong, that they perceive themselves to be right. And where does that, how do you untrack that, right? I mean, we're in a situation, it seems to me, where neither side is particularly persuaded that they're doing the wrong thing, and are totally persuaded that the other side is doing the wrong thing. So how would you, I mean, you've got this kind of, you know, kind of thoughtful objective. Well, they should see it this way, and we should see it this way, because it's only rational to assume that we, you know, that the worst choice, the only bad choices. But nobody's acting that way, right? And so we can debate rational actor stuff all we want, but both sides are quite convinced that the other is making great mistakes, and each doesn't seem to be terribly troubled by the course that they're on. So how do you change that?
It's remarkable. It is really remarkable. And to your alternative hypothesis, it's a very compelling hypothesis. And I think if you're sitting and we're having this discussion just 6 days before the 20th Party Congress, I do think you could make a compelling case. And I should say, for a country of China's proportions, one of the challenges of analyzing a resurgent China is it's so, because of its proportions and because of its complexities and its contradictions, virtually any narrative you tell about China is a plausible one. So if you want to stitch together a narrative that China's power is perhaps that Xi Jinping is anxious about his country's long-term prospects, you could stitch together a compelling narrative. If you want to suggest that Xi Jinping is increasingly confident about China's role in the world, you could stitch together a coherent narrative. But to your alternative hypothesis, there is a compelling case to be made if you're in China that, look, China has defied many prognostications of collapse. I mean, I remember reading headlines going back, big headlines, front page headlines in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Financial Times, going back to 2002, 2003. China's about to have a hard landing. The Chinese real estate bubble is going to collapse. And at a certain point, Tom Orlick has a Bloomberg. He wrote a book a couple of years ago saying China, the bubble that never pops, because China keeps on defying these prognostications of collapse. And so, if you're China, I think to your alternative suggestion of an alternative hypothesis, you could say, look, we've defied many prognostications of collapse. We're developing a greater capacity for domestic innovation. Our economy, sure, it's not growing at the torrid pace that it grew, say, in the 1990s or the 2000s, but it continues to grow. And as long as we're growing faster than the United States, that's all that we need. Our economy is about 80% as large as that of the United States. And to your point, if you look at high-level Chinese pronouncements, whether speeches, statements, you do get the sense that on balance, despite growing concern about certain challenges that China is facing internally and abroad, the general sense, I think the general sort of center of analytical gravity within China's foreign policy establishment is that China's prospect, that time is on China's side. And so if you believe that time is on your side, you see your comprehensive national power continuing to grow despite growing constraints at home and abroad, then maybe one hypothesis you render is, sure, we're very cognizant that much of the international community condemns the way, for example, that we treat the Uyghurs. Or sure, we're aware that the Quad is increasingly mobilizing against us, but if our comprehensive national power continues to grow, maybe we don't really need to pay much heed to those sentiments, because in due course, middle powers, namely just observing this rivalry between the United States and China, they'll see that, look, the center of geopolitical and, importantly, underpinning it, geoeconomic gravity is shifting more and more towards the Asia-Pacific. It's shifting more and more towards China. And so perhaps a hypothesis is that whatever criticisms other countries have about our conduct internally and externally, they'll have to make accommodations for us in due course. So that is a hypothesis that we have to consider as well.
Right, and just to add another piece to that, if you add an assessment that on the Chinese side, that really there's nothing we could do that would get these others ones to live with us anyway, why bother, right? I mean, that we can win this, and there's really no point. We've tried, but there's no point, because they're really not serious. They really can't accommodate a great power. So let me ask one more question, then we'll go to the audience. So get your questions ready. You can't have this conversation without having a conversation about Taiwan, right?
Yeah,
so we have to talk briefly about Taiwan.
Course.
Okay, so the question is, if there were going to be an accommodation, right? For sure, that isn't the only thing that would have to be resolved, but you couldn't have an accommodation without some degree of stability on the understanding. So we had one for a long time, and we clearly have much less of one now. What could you envision would be a sustainable basis that might underpin the kind of relationship with China that you've kind of sketched out in the book?
Yes, I mean, well, exactly that, even though it's concerning that now it seems that, I think, an arrangement that has served the United States, China, and I would argue Taiwan well for the better part of the past, for several decades now. It's concerning that it seems that settlement or that kind of equilibrium, unstable equilibrium that has held nonetheless, it's concerning that more and more folks seem to be convinced that it's untenable, because I think it has served Taiwan well. I really think that it's important. So several elements. One, I think that we should reject the presumption or the fatalism that says that settlement that has served Taiwan, I would argue quite well, for several decades is no longer tenable. I think we need to push back against that fatalism. Speaking of fatalism, one of my best friends lives in Taiwan, and I was talking with him and his wife a few weeks ago, and he said to me, he said, Ali, the greatest enemy of Taiwan is not Chinese coercion, it's fatalism that war is inevitable. He said, remember, he said that Taiwan is not, don't think of Taiwan as being just sort of a pawn on a great geopolitical chessboard. It's a thriving democracy, 23 million people strong, and it's important that Washington and Beijing recognize that if they believe that war is inevitable, if they take steps that make that likelihood, that outcome more likely, that Taiwan would be ultimately suffer the most. So rejecting fatalism that war is inevitable, thinking of ways that we can reinvigorate a certain status quo that I think has served Taiwan well. And I would make one last point, or two last points on how we might, I think, kind of dissuade or prevent worst-case outcomes. Number one is, in addition to thinking about how we arm Taiwan militarily, I think we need to be thinking about supporting Taiwan, and as we are, in a more multifaceted capacity. So what can we do to strengthen Taiwan economically? What can we do to strengthen its profile diplomatically in the international system? So strengthening Taiwan on a multifaceted basis. The second point that I would make is, in terms of perhaps forestalling worst-case scenarios, is here's an opportunity for the United States perhaps to lean into Xi Jinping's aspirations, whatever they might be. And I hope that this conversation comes up between President Biden and President Xi at the G20 summit in Bali this November. I hope that President Biden and his top advisors say to President Xi, look, Putin, your alleged best friend, I think Xi at one point called him his best friend. I'm not sure Xi would call him his best friend anymore, just given the way that the war has been going. But look, President Xi, Putin had certain aspirations. He sees himself as the avatar of modern China, and with his catastrophic invasion of Ukraine and the fallout from that invasion, Putin is basically presiding over the destruction of his nation in real time. It's a really, and when we talk about competition, there might be some who revel in glee that, look, Russia, it's engaged in catastrophic strategic self-sabotage and it advantages the United States. But leaving aside the realm of geopolitics and just thinking about, in very human terms, the atrocities that Ukraine is suffering, the suffering that many ordinary Russians are experiencing who are opposed to what Putin is doing. It's a human tragedy to see Putin presiding over the destruction of whatever ambitions he may have had for Russia. And I would prevail upon President Xi, as Min Shinpei, Andy Nathan, and many other scholars have suggested, that the single step that would do more to end the China dream than any other step would be an invasion of Taiwan. And Xi Jinping sees himself as the avatar of a strong, modern, resurgent China. He wants to accomplish the China dream however he conceptualizes it. And I would say to President Xi, an invasion of Taiwan, when you think about the military, economic, diplomatic devastation that you would incur, the likelihood for tremendous political instability at home that could jeopardize your rule, President Xi, do you want to be seen as the leader who presided over China's modern resurgence into being the second most powerful country in the world? Or do you want to be seen as the leader who had an extraordinary great power opportunity of its own and squandered it with misbegotten ambition over Taiwan?
Or, as he would see it, do you want to be the leader who lost Taiwan?
Yes, another possibility.
All right, so on that,
Yes.
let's go to the audience. Let's start. All right, go ahead.
Hi, Ali. Thanks so much for this talk and presentation. I want to ask about the aspect of competition that refers to the norms in international relations, specifically spheres of influence, right? One of the aspects of resurgence of China is the notion of spheres of influence. And I want to ask you two things. One, to what extent do you think the U.S. can proactively direct global norms, perhaps by joining UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, that might have major ramifications around norms? And what do you think, speaking of spheres of influence, what do you think should the U.S. do when it comes to the Western Hemisphere and Latin America as the policy towards a pivot to Asia and the Pacific presumably continues? Thank you.
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much. It's great to see you. And thanks for the questions. So the first, I think that what's remarkable about UNCLOS is, and again, I was saying earlier that in this town, folks don't agree on anything. It's remarkable the degree of bipartisan. I wouldn't say it goes to. I hesitate to say that there's a consensus on anything in Washington, but something approaching a consensus on the imperative of joining UNCLOS, ratifying UNCLOS. Republicans, Democrats alike, foreign policy luminaries in both parties, and the United States doesn't do itself any favors by not being a part of that agreement, normatively, legally, and otherwise. So I think that there is an increasingly, there has been, and I think increasingly is a self-evident case, and particularly, when it comes to expressing concerns, say, about China's militarization of the South China Sea or its impingements upon the exclusive economic zones of neighboring countries, obviously being part of UNCLOS, it gives you greater normative and legal footing on which to stand it. And just as a broader point, just going beyond the aperture of UNCLOS, more generally, multilateral institutions, they're not a silver bullet for exercising U.S. influence, but I think that on balance, if you want to exercise greater legal influence, normative influence, geopolitical influence, it's far better to be present in agreements and institutions and try to revise them as a participant than to bemoan them by virtue of being absent from the outside. I think the criticism from within is likely to be far more effective. And to your second question, I think that increasingly, whether it's, you mentioned Latin America, but I would say take Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, I think increasingly the vast majority of regions in the world, they saw Cold War 1.0, they don't want to do that again. They don't want to have to make, first of all, they don't want to have to make choices between great powers, and increasingly they say, does that choice even really exist? Why can't it be the case, and why shouldn't it be the case that in order to advance my vital national interests, I do business with the United States as warranted, I do business with China as warranted. A good example, if you look at Indonesia. So Indonesia will be hosting the G20 summit, and the G20 summit, I'm sure it's going to be quite a tense affair. You have President Biden will be there, President Xi will be there, President Putin will be there, and the president of Indonesia was asked, so you're going to have a pretty kind of lots of fireworks, a pretty contentious summit, and he said, Indonesia wants to be friends with everyone. Now, Indonesia, it's a very populous country, it's a major economic player, and Indonesia is not alone in expressing those sentiments about saying that we reject choices between great powers, we reject the notion that only certain countries can operate, that we can only operate with certain, engage with certain countries. India has expressed that sentiment, Singapore has expressed that sentiment, Australia has expressed that sentiment. So I think that a critical part of competitiveness for the United States going forward is in engaging with, when it goes to, again, whether it's Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, don't lean in and begin the conversation by saying, please don't do what China and Russia are telling you to do. That's a losing strategy, and it centers the conversation around your competitors rather than around you. I think that the United States, whether it's talking about infrastructure offerings, connectivity offerings, whatever it might be, the United States, its allies and partners should begin their conversations by saying, first, listen, asking questions. What issues are top of mind for you, number one? Number two, how can we help? Number three, given what you've said about how we can help you, here's what we can constructively offer. And if China and Russia come up, you can then say, here's why we think what we're offering is perhaps more compelling. But I think, again, just to summarize, the overwhelming majority of countries in the world, keep in mind the great power competition, it's a very exclusionary paradigm. Most observers who talk about great power competition, they only refer to three countries. The United States, China, and Russia. Well, they're about, I don't know how many, I don't know the exact count of countries in the world, but most countries are not great powers. Most of them are not part of that set of three. So I think recognizing that the overwhelming majority of countries, they want to conceptualize their national identities and advance their national interests outside that paradigm of great power competition, and they want to be not instrumentalized, but they want to be seen as exercising their own agency.
Right here.
Thank you. Hi, Ali. I believe we had a conversation about a week ago. For everybody, I had Ali on for my podcast, and it's great to speak with you again. I attended SAIS about 2-3 years ago. So when we were having our conversation, there was one question I wanted to ask you, but we ran out of time. We're talking a lot about great powers, but what about middle powers? One of my favorite classes I had here was with Professor Christopher Sands, who takes us through middle powers and sort of regional powers or thematic powers like, say, energy. So you just mentioned one, potentially, Indonesia, but I'm quite curious to hear where you think, as The Economist coined it, meddling middle powers. So Turkey, UAE, think in the Horn of Africa. Where do you see them in this dynamic? Are they going to create more opportunities for great powers, or are they going to be a fly in the ointment depending upon how much they want to, say, be a regional hegemon or something like that?
Well, first, thank you. It's wonderful to see you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to come on your podcast. I really, really enjoyed our conversation. My answer would be both. In terms of kind of the meddling middle powers, I think that they have the potential to be both. So one, I think that they create opportunities for great powers because great powers recognize that an essential part of maintaining their competitive edge is currying favor with those middle powers. So if you cannot sustain your status as a great power, however you define the term great power. You can't sustain your competitive edge if you're not currying favor with. And again, I think that sometimes when we make this rather arbitrary distinction between great powers and middle powers, there are a number of middle powers who are quite formidable military and economic powers in their own right. Like Australia, India, Japan, South Korea. I mean, these are formidable, formidable middle powers. And I know that there are many countries that have larger economies than Russia's economy that are not considered great powers. So again, the terminology is a bit muddled. So one, it's an opportunity. So if you are a great power and if you are smart about how you try to curry favor with these middle powers, it's an opportunity. At the same time, if you don't tend to your relationships with those middle powers, remember George Shultz famously said that diplomacy is the art of gardening. You have to tend to the garden. You have to tend to your relationships. If you're not tending those relationships with middle powers, if they feel that you're neglecting them, if they feel even worse that you're instrumentalizing them or actively ignoring their preferences, then they can become a fly in the ointment. I think one example right now in terms of a country that many others are trying to curry favor with. Look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a very good example. So the United States has long had a relationship with Saudi Arabia. It's been tumultuous, but it's been a long-standing relationship. And in light of just geopolitical dynamics of recent years, we now have this growing relationship between Saudi Arabia and Russia, which is a big problem for if you're the United States, if you're the West. You're trying to think of ways in which you can deprive Putin of energy revenue, but this relationship between Saudi Arabia and Russia is problematic. And so I would imagine that going forward, there may well be a renewed push to think about, in the United States, how do we bring the United States or Saudi Arabia more and more to our side? Perhaps how do we drive some wedges? I don't know if they'll work, but how do we drive wedges between Saudi Arabia and Russia? But the point is that carefully cultivated, relationships with middle powers can be a major strategic opportunity for great powers. Studiously neglected or studiously discounted relationships with middle powers, they can become a fly in the ointment. So I think that they can be both.
Let's go over here.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask a question regarding the ideological dichotomy between the United States and China that the Biden administration is really focusing on. To what degree does China actually, what is their ideological model beyond simply being a big country that can act in an economically and interstate realist manner? And relatedly, are there other countries that have been able to do similar things that don't have variables like just being big working in their favor?
It's such a good question, and I think it's interesting as your question, I think it kind of raises a thought experiment. We often talk about an alleged China model, how exportable is it, but I think it's an interesting thought. What if China were orders of magnitude smaller economically? Would we be talking as much about a China model? I think, and I think that even the term China model is somewhat, it's a bit of an oxymoron, because I think that China's development and China's resurgence in many ways are sui generis. If you look at its population size, the way in which it's grown, sort of the fusing of certain elements of capitalism with certain elements of authoritarianism, there's a case to be made that China's resurgence is quite sui generis, and so there's sort of, it begs the question intrinsically, is there even a China model? Many luminaries in the academy, in the Chinese academy, disclaim the existence of a China model, but when someone says the China model is X, I kind of struggle to think about what it is beyond the elements that you describe, but certainly I think I will say, I think a big element of the model, if one exists, and there is a debate about whether a model exists or whether China's development has been sui generis, I think a big element of the model, again, I was talking earlier about narrative considerations, psychological considerations, a big part of the China model is that we have a big economy now, our economy is likely to grow bigger, the United States is having difficulties at home, and so what China says to a lot of countries in vast stretches of the developing world, in addition to sort of decrying the alleged excesses of democracy, China will say, okay, well, maybe you don't agree with us about our critiques of democracy, but China has demonstrated that, at least in theory, there's an alternative way of developing. So I think that there are two parts of, I wouldn't call it the model, but part of, I guess, China's story that it tells to developing countries. One is, again, trying to gain traction for these narratives that China is inexorably resurgent, and so you basically need to see the writing on the wall, make accommodations. And the second part is, even if you don't agree with our criticisms of democracy, look at how China's developed. China is in many ways ideologically antithetical to the United States, and given its remarkable resurgence, there must be another way. And so I think that a lot of countries right now, they're trying to sort of figure out if there's one country that kind of has figured it out, that has sort of mastered the challenges of modernity, and it's not clear to me that any one country has. The United States has lots of challenges at home, China has lots of challenges at home, European countries have lots of challenges at home, and so I do think that a big kind of question going forward is which countries, which systems, which models will demonstrate greatest competence in administering solutions and providing solutions to these socioeconomic challenges.
So let me just interject, because I think it's quite important. I think the problem is more complicated than that. I think that there was a time in which China was relatively indifferent to the form of government that other countries had, so long as they had good relations with China. But I think China has come to the view that it actually benefits from having other authoritarian governments. And I do think there's a China model. It's a Leninist political model. It's not an economic model, but it's a very clear Leninist political model. Yeah. And I think what worries people now more than the old China is that it used to be China says, it's none of our business. You do whatever you want, just treat us nicely. Now there's some reason to think that China actively is supporting governments that are more like it because it thinks it's better off in a world in which there are more governments like that. And that's more challenging to us and to our partners. Let me take one more question. We're kind of starting to run out of time here. I will go right back there. Sorry, I know there are a lot more, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you both for this fantastic conversation. I think there is a growing narrative that if Russia were to test or use a tactical nuclear weapon on Ukrainian soil, that it would be such a significant event that China would have to permanently sever its relationship with Russia, and China would join the world community in further isolating Russia. But what if that doesn't happen? What if Russia tests or uses a nuclear weapon on Ukrainian soil and China does nothing to alter its relationship? What would the next step for the United States be vis-a-vis China?
I'm glad we're getting close to the end of the hour. Because I think it's such a profound, sobering, and important question. I mean, everybody is discussing. I'll offer some very speculative thoughts. I think it's very unlikely to imagine a scenario in which China publicly would jettison its relationship with Russia for a number of reasons. One, jettisoning its relationship with Russia would, I think, politically be humiliating for China, because remember, it's on February 4th, 2022, just a few weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine. You remember China and Russia famously alleged that their partnership had, or that their friendship had no limits. I think if I'm China, I'm realizing that the relationship evidently does have more limits than I had appreciated 7 or 8 months ago. So one, they don't want to be seen as doing kind of a humiliating about face that would basically say that, look, you doubled down and invested in a relationship that proved to be problematic, number one. Number two, I mentioned earlier that China's relationships with most other major powers, particularly advanced industrial democracies, those are either stagnating or deteriorating. And so China sees a deepening relationship with Russia as kind of a bulwark against growing pressure from advanced industrial democracies. So I think that it's unlikely to, for that reason alone, to throw Russia under the bus. Having registered those two caveats that I just did, do I think that China is becoming increasingly concerned about its relationship with Russia? I think that the answer is yes. And I think that there are a couple of pieces of evidence that one could adduce. First, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. I think it's very, very telling. And now, this is a summit that I believe it was President Xi's first international travel since the beginning of COVID-19. So obviously, it's significant. It's his first international travel since the beginning of the pandemic. And President Putin, on September 15th, he says, "We acknowledge that China has questions and concerns about the course of the war." It's inconceivable to me that Putin would have made that admission of his own volition. I mean, to say publicly at a forum that's being watched around the world that your principal diplomatic and economic patron has questions and concerns about the war, why would you say that of your own accord? My supposition is that President Xi probably took President Putin aside privately, and said, "I'm not going to embarrass you publicly, but this war has not gone as we had thought it was going to go. This war has not gone as you had told us it was going to go." My sense is that before Russia had actually invaded Ukraine, my sense is that China probably thought that Russia was indeed just going to conduct a special military operation, or that if it did launch a full-fledged invasion, that Ukraine would capitulate overnight. Well, now the war is dragging on well over 7 months. So that was September 15th. And then when Putin announced a partial mobilization, China immediately called for a ceasefire. I'm sure Putin wasn't happy with that result. I think that China right now, and again, I certainly can't take credit, but I think it's a very good formulation from Evan Medeiros. Evan Medeiros, he talks about a policy trilemma that China faces vis-a-vis Russia. He says, if you're China and dealing with Russia, you have three objectives that you're trying to uphold simultaneously. Number one, you want to demonstrate your commitment to sovereignty and territorial integrity. Number two, you want to maintain your relationship with Russia. And number three, you want to maintain your relationships in the West. It's becoming harder and harder. The longer the war goes on, the harder it is to achieve that policy trilemma. And in particular, I think that there's a recognition in China that in the medium to long run, the impact, the healthy impact of a stronger Sino-Russian relationship isn't necessarily going to be enough to offset the negative impact or the unfavorable impact on China's strategic outlook of declining relationships with advanced industrial democracies. So I think that, again, I don't think that China will throw Russia under the bus publicly, but will it think about ways in which it can incrementally distance itself, recalibrate so that it can salvage as best as possible its relationships in the West? I'm sure that has to be an active conversation going on at the highest levels in Beijing right now. And so that'll be a very crucial watch point after the 20th Party Congress is over. Do we see real evidence of recalibration in Beijing vis-a-vis Moscow? So we should all be watching.
Well, lots to talk about here. We've just scratched the surface. Let me just say to all of you that this is an important and really thoughtful book. It doesn't necessarily conform to the contemporary thinking in other parts of Washington, D.C., but I do think it's a must-read, and it really does challenge us in a lot of ways to think about whether there are alternatives to the current rather perilous path that both countries are on right now in terms of our relationship. So let me ask you to join me in thanking Ali for a terrific presentation and a great book.
This is good.